Late in August of 2018, an ice patch in Canada's Yukon pulled back across 23 days, and the melt gravel underneath it was holding a complete hunting weapon, frozen since the day somebody lost it. Nobody in this part of the world had ever picked up a complete one before, and the lab date on that ancient wood came back at about 6,000 years. That's the best preserved weapon anyone has taken out of Yukon ice, but it's nowhere close to the oldest. The oldest sits in the same collection, off a patch called Gladstone, and it goes back about 9,000 calendar years. You'd walk straight past it on a trail. So the question this whole collection turns on isn't what a complete weapon looks like. It's what 9,000 years actually leaves you, and how does anybody still read what's left? The 2018 weapon came out of an ice patch in the Alligator Lake area of the southern Yukon, and it's a throwing dart. Just over 6.5 feet of birch, a little over 2 meters in the published measurements, built in 3 sections joined end to end. Sinew still cinched around the joints, a chipped stone point at the front, and 3 feathers still bound to the tail. 6,000 years in the ground, and the bindings were still tight. That shouldn't be possible. Wood doesn't survive 9,000 years anywhere on this planet without a very specific reason, and the reasons are usually a dry cave, a desert, or a waterlogged bog that seals the air out. There are no dry caves on those slopes. There's no desert, and there's no bog. There's snow, and mountains, and caribou, and in most of the world, snow is exactly where organic material goes to be destroyed. So what's up there that a wooden shaft can sit inside for 9,000 years and come back out readable? The southern Yukon has real glaciers. These aren't them. A glacier is a body of ice with enough mass to flow. It moves under its own weight, slowly and constantly, and as it moves it scrapes and grinds and drags everything it's carrying. Rock gets crushed into flour. Anything soft that falls into a glacier is torn apart or hauled miles from where it went in, then spat out at the snout decades later as splinters, if it comes out at all. A glacier is a slow machine for taking things apart. An alpine ice patch behaves nothing like that. Winter snow blows across the high country and piles into the same shaded hollows year after year, always the lee slopes, always where the wind drops its load. Each winter's snow packs the last one down until it compresses into ice that mostly just sits there. Richard Farnell and the biologists who studied these patches drew the distinction plainly. Nothing grinds, nothing gets hauled downhill on a conveyor belt, and nothing sits under crushing pressure. Something that lands on the surface in late summer gets buried by the next snowfall and stays roughly where it fell. Gladstone, the patch holding that 9,000-year shaft, sits at about 6,300 feet on a mountainside east of Treeline Lake. Cold, shaded, and going nowhere. But sitting still isn't the same as staying intact, so why doesn't a piece of wood up there simply rot where it lands? You've probably picked a stick up off a wet forest floor and had it come apart in your hand. Moisture gets into the grain. Insects get in behind the moisture. Microbes work on the fibers from the inside, and every freeze and thaw cycle splits the wood open a little further and lets more water in, which speeds up everything else. Sinew rots. Feathers disintegrate. Whatever was holding the thing together breaks down and lets go. On open ground, that entire process finishes inside a human lifetime, which is why almost everything we know about deep prehistory in the north arrives as stone. Stone points, stone scrapers, stone flakes, occasionally bone. The wooden part of the toolkit, the shafts and handles and bindings and cords that every one of those stone tools was attached to, is missing from nearly every site on the continent, because it rotted long before anybody came to dig. The tools survive. The way they were built doesn't. Under an ice patch, almost none of that decay can start. It's cold enough that microbes barely function, dark enough that ultraviolet light never reaches the wood, and stable enough that the freeze and thaw cycle doing most of the mechanical damage doesn't happen. Water is locked up as ice instead of moving through the fibers, and insects aren't up there at all. So a birch shaft goes into the snow at the end of a hunting trip, gets sealed in, and then essentially nothing happens to it for the next several thousand years. An ice patch that never moves also never empties, which means whatever went into one is still sitting roughly where it went in. So who was up on those mountains losing things, and how did anybody ever think to go and look? Nobody did think to go and look. That part was luck, and it took until 1997. That September, Kristen Benedek and her husband, a wildlife biologist named Jerry Kuzik, were out hunting sheep in the mountains near Kusawa Lake. They came over a patch of alpine ice called Thandlät, well above the tree line, and what stopped them wasn't a weapon. It was dung, a dense mat of caribou pellets lying exposed on the surface of the ice, thawing out and starting to smell, and enough of it to look like a herd had stood in one place through an entire season. For most people, that's a mess to walk around. For a caribou biologist, none of it added up. Caribou weren't using that ground anymore and hadn't been for a long time, and dung on a mountainside doesn't keep. Anything organic lying out at that elevation should have been gone within a decade, so what was it still doing there? He stopped, and he looked, and because he was already looking, he saw the second thing. At the melting edge of the ice there was a stick. It had been shaped. Someone had worked it down into a shaft. There was sinew still wrapped around one end of it, and where the sinew was, there were feathers. They were standing above the tree line. Nothing grows up there worth carving, and there's no plausible way for a piece of worked wood to blow to that elevation and land in a snow patch with its fletching still attached. A person had carried it up and left it there. The only question left was when. The lab came back at 4,360 radiocarbon years, give or take 50. Kuzik and his colleagues wrote it up in the journal Arctic 2 years later, and it's a strange document to read now, because it's a wildlife study that walked into archaeology. It set out to ask where caribou used to live. It answered a much older question about where people used to hunt. One shaft from one patch is an accident. What turned it into something else was the thought that followed. If gear had been coming off that patch, gear had been coming off the others, and nobody had ever checked, because nobody had a reason to think there was anything up there to check. So within 2 years, the searching stopped being accidental. Crews started flying the high country in late summer, looking for the same thing Kuzik had walked into by chance, melting alpine patches with old dung coming out of them. Within a few field seasons, those mountains were handing over objects by the dozen, from ice nobody had bothered to climb to before. An accident had turned into an archive, and an archive can answer a question a single lucky find never could. How deep does it go? By 2010, surveyors had located 84 ice patches across the southern Yukon. 43 of them were holding biological material, mostly caribou, and 24 of those were also holding things people had made. Close to a third of every patch anybody bothered to check turned out to be a site. Out of those 24 came 207 cataloged artifacts and more than 1,700 animal remains. Greg Hare, Christian Thomas, Tim Topper, and Ruth Gotthard published the full accounting in Arctic in 2012, and it's still the spine of everything anybody says about these mountains. The floor of that record is the object from Gladstone. It's cataloged as JHVL1, item 32, lab number beta 185972, dated to 8,360 radiocarbon years before present, which works out to roughly 9,000 calendar years. And this is what 9,000 years leaves you: a medial segment of a dart shaft. Not the point, not the tail, just a length out of the middle, and it came out of the ice in 4 pieces. The published description calls it nondescript. So how does anybody read an object like that? Carefully, and by what can be measured rather than what can be recognized. The wood itself carries enough carbon to be dated directly, so the age doesn't depend on what it was lying next to or how deep it was buried. The identification comes off the shaft as well. Both papers catalog it as dart shaft fragments rather than arrow, a call made on the wood in the tray, not on anything found beside it. And it isn't alone up there. A second fragment from the same patch, item 39, came in at 8,290 radiocarbon years, which is close enough to say people were hunting on Gladstone across generations rather than once. Neither piece would stop you on a hiking trail. Both are older than any surviving woodwork most people have ever heard of. Dart shafts keep appearing in that ice, on and off, for about 7,000 years after that, right up to around 1,250 years ago. And the collection as a whole doesn't stop there. It runs forward through arrows and antler and copper, and finally lands on a 19th century musket ball sitting in the same freezer as a 9,000-year-old shaft, which is the clearest proof available that people never stopped going up. So how many objects does it take before a run of luck turns into a record? That scale is what separates this from a single spectacular find. One complete dart looks like a miracle, and a miracle is easy for a skeptic to wave off as a fluke of preservation. 207 objects and over 1,700 animal remains spread across dozens of mountains and 9,000 years aren't a fluke. They're a system, running continuously, in a place the textbooks had almost nothing to say about. 4 pieces of a plane shaft is what the deep end of that system gives back. 6,000 years gave back an entire weapon with the binding still holding, and that's the one that can answer a question the stone record has never been able to touch. Not what these people hunted with, but how they built it. What does a hunting weapon actually look like when you can finally see all of it at once? A throwing dart isn't one piece of wood. Across the Yukon collection, Hare and his colleagues found 3 different ways of building one, and all 3 were running at the same time. Some darts are a single shaft, worked end to end out of one length of wood. Some have a foreshaft, a short separate piece at the front carrying the stone point, socketed into the main body so a tip could be swapped or replaced without rebuilding the whole weapon. And some are segmented, built from several sections joined along their length. 81 wooden dart elements have been identified in the collection so far, and those 3 approaches sit alongside each other in it for thousands of years, which tells you they weren't stages in an evolution. They were options. So what does a hunter gain by picking one over another? Hold that, because there's a limit on how far back the question can even be asked, and the archaeologists say so themselves. The oldest material, the segments older than about 7,000 years, is usually too fragmentary to assign to any class at all. You can date a piece of shaft with confidence, and often you still can't tell what kind of dart it belonged to. So the 3 classes describe the middle and late stretches of this record, and nothing at all about the bottom of it. Then there's the wood. The country up there grows birch, willow, and spruce, and the darts we can identify are birch, which is a choice rather than an accident, because willow and spruce were standing right there. Birch is dense enough to carry force, and springy enough to bend without breaking. Which leaves the problem a single stick of it can't solve on its own. How do you join 2 lengths of wood so the seam survives being thrown? The 2018 dart from Alligator Lake is the segmented kind, and it's the one that survived intact enough to read all the way through. 3 sections of birch. The ends where they meet were cut at long, shallow angles, so the pieces overlap and seat against each other across a broad surface instead of butting together end to end. That's a scarf joint, and it's a real piece of engineering, because a butt joint under load snaps at the seam, while a long angled overlap spreads the force down the length of the wood. Anyone who has ever spliced 2 pieces of anything together has arrived at the same solution. These people arrived at it 6,000 years ago, on a mountain, with stone tools. The joints are wrapped in sinew, and not simply wrapped. In places, the sinew is threaded through holes pierced into the wood itself, so the binding is anchored into the shaft rather than cinched around the outside of it, which is the difference between a wrap that can creep and a joint that can't. The chert point at the front is held on the same way, and at the back, 3 carefully prepared feathers, bound down with more sinew, the fletching that keeps a shaft flying straight instead of tumbling. So how much of that craft would ever reach you from a normal dig? Almost none of it. Every one of those decisions is invisible in a stone tool site. You can excavate 1,000 chert points and never learn that the shaft behind them was made in 3 pieces, or that the fletching was done in threes, or that somebody had worked out how to anchor a binding through wood rather than around it. Which brings back the question of why you'd build a weapon in sections at all. A single shaft is simpler to make, and it's also finished the moment it snaps. You're a long walk from anywhere, holding a stone point with no way to throw it. A segmented dart is a repairable dart. Break the front third against a rock, and you carry a spare front third. That design is somebody's answer to a bad day on a mountain, and it means these hunters were building for failure on purpose, thousands of years before anybody wrote any of it down. There's one more thing on that dart, and it isn't wood or sinew or stone. When conservators looked closely at it, they found an orange-red residue, smeared where two birch sections overlap, and again up at the fletching. Somebody had put something there, deliberately, in the two places where a weapon like that gets assembled. So what was it? In 2021, Kate Helvig, Jennifer Poulin, Valerie Monahan, and Christian Thomas published the answer, and it isn't a material anybody predicted. They ran the residue through infrared spectroscopy, which reads how a substance absorbs light to identify the chemical bonds inside it, and then through pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry, which heats a sample until it breaks apart and then sorts and weighs the fragments. What came back was a specific chemical signature. Substituted phenols, phenolic dimers, coumarins, xanthines, cholesterol derivatives, traces of protein. Then they went and got reference material from the castor sacs of recently trapped beavers, ran that the same way, and the two profiles matched. The residue on a 6,000-year-old hunting weapon from a Yukon mountain is castoreum, beaver secretion, from the glands near the tail. The paper calls that two separate firsts, and the wording matters. It's the earliest evidence anywhere of castoreum used in the fabrication of weaponry, and it's the first chemical identification of that substance anywhere in the archaeological record. Not the first time somebody guessed, the first time anybody proved it, which leaves the harder half of the finding wide open. What was it for? What it was doing there is still open, and the people who published it are careful about that. Valerie Monahan, one of the co-authors and a conservator with the Yukon government, has said it may have been some kind of adhesive, or that the reddish color itself may have carried cultural or spiritual meaning. Castoreum is oily and water repellent, so weatherproofing is live too. So is the idea that it kept sinew and feathers supple, instead of letting them dry out and go brittle in thin alpine air. And there's a reason nobody working on it wants to simply call it the glue. The hafting adhesive in this same collection has already been identified, and it's a different substance entirely. Red ochre mixed with spruce resin, used to seat stone components into their hafts. So, castoreum isn't the obvious answer to a question that was already answered somewhere else in the same toolkit. It's a second material, chosen separately, and put where the joints and the fletching are. Whatever the reason was, the choice was deliberate. A residue found once might be contamination, something an object brushed against on its way into the ground. A residue found at the joints and at the fletching, matched against a known reference profile, is a decision. Somebody went out, took castoreum from a beaver, carried it above the tree line, and put it on the parts of the weapon they'd just finished assembling. That's knowledge somebody was taught and carried up a mountain on purpose, and the reason for it hasn't survived alongside the object, which raises something the weapon can't answer by itself. Building a dart like that is hours of work before you ever leave camp, and then you carry it up a mountain, past the last trees, onto old ice in the middle of summer. What was standing up there that was worth all of that? Caribou. Every dart in that collection traces back to them. In summer, the southern Yukon alpine turns hostile for a large animal in a heavy coat. Heat builds through the long northern day, and the insects come with it. Mosquitoes, black flies, warble flies, in numbers that can drive an animal off its feed entirely, and a caribou that can't graze through July goes into winter already thin. So the herds climb. They go up past the tree line to the old snow still holding in the shaded hollows, and they stand on it. The surface is cold, the air moving across it is colder, and the bugs thin out over bare ice. A caribou will spend most of a hot afternoon up there, doing almost nothing, which is exactly what it needs to be doing. People followed. If you're hunting an animal that's alert, fast, and built to outrun you across open country, the best ground you'll ever get is the ground where it chooses to stand still. Sheep use the high country too, so the hunting happened at altitude, on and around the ice. And the people who live there knew this long before a radiocarbon lab confirmed any of it. The oral history around Kosawa Lake holds that caribou were once all over that country, which is a plain statement of fact from families who hunted it, and it describes exactly the situation the Dung on Thandlät records. Nothing about these places suggests anyone lived on them. There are no house floors above the tree line, no hearths, no trash middens, none of the debris that piles up where people actually stay. What's up there is the ice and whatever got dropped on it. So how long does a summer habit have to run before it leaves something you can measure? You can answer that, because the dung goes down. When Kuzik and his colleagues looked into the Thandlät patch, the pellets weren't only sitting on the surface where the melt had exposed them. They pulled material from roughly 5 feet below the top of that deposit. It dated to about 2,450 years ago. 5 feet of the same summer habit, one animal at a time, packed and frozen and stacked until it reads like layers in a lake bed. A herd passing through once doesn't leave that. That's a place, used the same way, by generation after generation of animals, with generation after generation of hunters walking up behind them. The weapon they carried up there to do the work was an atlatl, and the name does the object no favors, because the thing itself is simple. It's a board roughly the length of your forearm with a hook or a spur carved at the far end. The butt of the dart seats against that hook. You hold the board, you bring your arm through, and at the last instant the board rotates and adds its whole length to the throw. Your arm effectively gets a second joint. The dart comes off faster and flatter than anything a person can throw by hand, and it carries enough force to drive a stone point deep into an animal bigger than you are. That's also why the shaft has to be long and springy instead of stiff. Through the throw, the dart bends, loads up the way a drawn bow does, and snaps straight as it leaves the hook. A rigid pole won't do that. Birch will. So how does a weapon built that carefully end up abandoned in a snowbank? Because in that setting, gear breaks. Throws go wide and bury themselves in a drift. Shafts snap against rock. A point stays in the wound and walks off with the animal. Things get dropped into fresh snow and never seen again, because a wooden shaft lying in fresh snow disappears in about 2 seconds. The technique never fully died out in the north either. Yupik hunters in western Alaska will tell you they still use throwing boards on the water and describe them as ordinary working equipment rather than heritage. On the other side of the planet, Aboriginal Australians throw with the woomera, which is the same physics arrived at independently. Neither of those is proof of an unbroken line running from a Yukon ice patch into a living hand, and nobody working on this collection claims that it is. What they show is that the idea is good enough that people keep finding it worth knowing. In the southern Yukon, it held for roughly 7,000 years. Then, inside a couple of centuries, it stops appearing in the ice at all. What replaces a system that's worked for 7 millennia, and how does it do it that fast? The last throwing dart in the record carries a catalog number like everything else. JCUU1, item 17, dated to 1240 radiocarbon years before present, give or take 40. After that entry, the darts stop, and they don't taper off the way you'd expect a 7,000-year habit to taper. There's no long stretch where the two systems overlap in the ice while people make up their minds. What replaces them shows up almost immediately. The oldest dated bow in the whole collection is catalogued JCUU2, item 6, at 1180 years before present, plus or minus 40, and it came out of the Alligator patch. The same neighborhood that later gave up the complete dart. It was recovered broken in 3 pieces. For 7 millennia before that, the throwing dart was effectively the only projectile technology in these mountains. Hare and his colleagues call the change abrupt. A hunter from 8,000 years ago and a hunter from 2,000 years ago would have recognized each other's gear on sight, and then inside a few generations the darts are gone and the arrows are everywhere. How does anybody watch a technology swap that happened 12 centuries ago in real time? Only because both systems were made of the same materials and got lost the same way, in the same ice. A dart is heavy and long, closer to a light spear than to anything you'd shoot. An arrow is short, light, and driven by a stored spring rather than a swung arm. So nobody had to reconstruct this swap from theory, or from stone points that could plausibly belong to either weapon. It's sitting there in the wood, sorted by radiocarbon date, one system leaving the record as the other one enters it. The broken bough carries the stranger detail, and it turns on what it was cut from. It's coastal maple. That species belongs to the Pacific side of the mountains, hundreds of miles from the patch it was found on. And bow technology shows up on that coast 300 to 400 years before it shows up in these ice patches. So the material and the method are arriving from the same direction, at roughly the same time, from a place with salt water in it. Something moved inland, over passes and down river valleys, and it carried a piece of coastal forest with it. Archery didn't get invented alone on a Yukon mountaintop. It walked in. The metal question lands here too, in the right phase. Some of the later arrow points in this collection are antler, with small end blades of native copper set into them. So, how old does metal on a projectile make it? The instinct is either to push the object backward in time, or to assume Europeans and shove it forward. In this archive, the copper sits exactly where the radiocarbon puts it. Late, in the bow era, well after the dart centuries rather than underneath them. The sequence follows the dates, and not the way an object looks in a photograph. And then there's one object in the collection that refuses to sit anywhere at all. Nearly everything with a knock, meaning the notch cut into the end of a shaft so a bowstring can seat in it, dates to after 1,200 years before present. There's a birch shaft filed under JCUU1, Item 1, with a distinct U-shaped knock cut into the end, and it has been dated twice. 3,510 years before present. 3,600 years before present. 2 separate runs, essentially the same answer, roughly 2,000 years, on the wrong side of a line that otherwise holds all the way across. Hare calls it aberrant, which is an honest way of saying nobody has explained it yet. Bow technology existed elsewhere in the Arctic long before this, so the object isn't impossible in principle. It's just a lone, one knocked shaft, 2,000 years early, sitting inside one of the most consistent technological sequences anybody has ever recovered in North America. And whatever would explain it, if anything ever does, is either still frozen a few slopes over, or already gone, which is the part nobody gets to control. So how much time is actually left? That patch above Alligator Lake had held its shape through thousands of summers. It gave up enough ground in 23 days to hand over a complete weapon, and it did that because the ice was losing. The moment wood comes out of ice, the clock that had been stopped starts running again. Fast. Sun works on the surface. Rain soaks it, and dry air pulls it back out, and the wetting and drying cycle opens the grain. Bindings that held for 6,000 years slacken and let go. A residue sitting on a scarf joint, the kind of residue it took a mass spectrometer to identify, washes off a slope in a season or two and takes its answer with it. Get to an object in time and a 6,000-year-old joint can still be read in a lab, right down to the chemistry somebody smeared into it. Arrive a few years late and you're not doing archaeology anymore. You're recording a loss, and that assumes somebody is there to pick it up. These patches sit at altitude in country with no roads, dozens of them scattered across a very large piece of ground, and the field season is a handful of weeks. The melt doesn't work around anyone's calendar. Things have almost certainly come out of that ice in years when nobody was standing there and simply gone. The same race is running in alpine ice elsewhere in the world, from the Alps to the Norwegian mountains, on the same clock and for the same reason. That process also explains a gap in the record that would otherwise look like an argument. Artifacts and animal remains thin out sharply before about 6,000 radiocarbon years ago, and out of every patch surveyed by 2010, only a handful held anything older than that. So does that mean fewer people were up there early on? The likelier reading, and the one Hare and his colleagues put forward, is that the warm middle stretch of the Holocene melted a lot of these patches out entirely, and whatever they were holding went with them. So a scarcity of early finds up here isn't automatic evidence that early people weren't hunting up here. It's often evidence that the ice which would have kept their gear is already gone. The archive has holes because the archive itself melted. So who decides what happens to a weapon once it does come out of that ice? In the Yukon, the answer isn't the one most people would guess. That 1997 find on Thandlät turned into a standing research project within about 2 years, and it was built as a partnership from the start. Yukon government archaeologists work it alongside 6 First Nations governments: the Carcross/Tagish First Nation, the Kwanlin Dun First Nation, the Tan Kwachan Council, the Champagne and Aishihik First Nations, the Kluane First Nation, and the Teslin Tlingit Council. The archaeologists you'd meet on a survey in these mountains are people like Greg Hare and Christian Thomas, and the mountains they're surveying are traditional territory, not empty backcountry that happen to have something in it. Sheila Greer and Diane Strand, writing in the same journal volume, describe the alpine here as a living cultural landscape rather than a site, a place people have used continuously, that they still use, where the ice is one part of a much longer relationship with the country. The paper on the complete dart names whose territories it came out of in its first paragraph, before it gets to the wood or the sinew or the date. So the surveys get planned together, the objects get conserved together, and when a result like the castoreum identification comes back from a lab, the announcement gets made together as well. When that result was published in 2021, Kwanlin Dun First Nation Chief Doris Bill put the finding in the plainest terms anybody has. They understood how to use the things around them to design complex and ingenious tools, like the atlatl. Ha Shadu Hen Linda Dixon of the Carcross/Tagish First Nation said of the people who made it, "Their resourcefulness and ingenuity continue to impress and teach us." So what does all of this actually rewrite? Not how or when people first reached this continent. That's a separate argument, resting on separate sites and separate evidence, and the word Yukon showing up on a map doesn't fold every northern discovery into it. What the patches rewrite is narrower. They hand back the parts of ancient life that almost never survive anywhere. The shaped wood, the bindings, the feathers, and the chemistry worked into a joint by somebody who knew exactly why it belonged there. A birch shaft lay on wet gravel under a shrinking wall of ice above Alligator Lake on a late August day in 2018. Somebody chose that birch. They split the build into 3 so a break in the field could be mended instead of abandoned, and shaped the ends so the sections would lock into one another. They bound the joints with sinew and ran ties through the wood to hold them. They fletched the tail with care. They went and got beaver castoreum and hauled it up the mountain with everything else and put it on the joints and the fletching for a reason we still don't have. Then they went up onto summer ice after an animal that had climbed there to get away from the flies. Nobody knows exactly how it left their hand. A throw that went wide is the ordinary answer, and the ordinary answer is usually the right one. The snow took it, and the snow kept it, feathers and bindings and all, for 6,000 years. Nobody was ever supposed to see any of that. A missed throw is the most ordinary thing that can happen on a hunt. And the only reason we know about this one is that it landed on the one surface in that whole country that keeps things. There are dozens more patches in those mountains, and they haven't finished melting yet. So what do you think is still up there, in the part that hasn't melted through? Leave your answer in the comments. And when you're ready for more lost evidence, click the video on screen to watch more.